King Charles III and his wife Camilla have been crowned in an elaborate ceremony of religious symbolism and pageantry. Yesterday's royal celebration continues for the rest of this weekend with several other events to take place, including a concert which actually saw a number of English musicians opt not to be part of it. But for a second, let's also take a look at the past jubilation and perhaps gaze back at Queen Elizabeth II's 70-year-old reign and the legacy left for King Charles III as he takes over the monarchy. Our guest is Emeritus Professor of History at UKZN. That's Professor Donal McCracken, who joins us via our video link this morning. Prof, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. And of course, there's going to be a lot said about what happens next. But perhaps let's look back for a while. Many people still adamant that King Charles is stepping into shoes that are almost impossible to fill, considering just how unprecedented Queen Elizabeth II's reign has been.
Yes. First of all, I have to say I think yesterday was a magnificent success, and I think that a lot of people learnt a lot of things about the monarchy yesterday and the ceremony and the pomp and what it means. So as an educational tool of constitutional government, I thought it was a magnificent case example. You're absolutely right. You know, new kings make new laws is the old adage. And everyone is looking to see what Charles III will do. But taking over after, it was like in 1603 when Elizabeth I died and James I took over. And, people were shaking their heads and saying it will never be the same as the great Queen. I also wonder if it isn't more difficult for a man to take over from a woman ruler, a successful woman ruler. But that's another matter we could debate. Look, the thing about Elizabeth I is that Elizabeth II is that she did achieve an awful lot, and in all the commentaries that I've been listening to over the last 2 days, no one has actually listed those things that she did. I mean, the things like the royal yacht were given up, symbolic things like that. The taxation, she started paying tax for the first time. The monarchy started paying tax for the first time. The abolition of the hereditary peerage system. In other words, you can't be made you can be made a life peer, which means you would be Lord McCracken for your life. But then the next generation can't inherit that title. The last person to be given that, I think, was Margaret Thatcher. And the whole way the monarchy operated, the concept of the walk around, which is actually a very difficult thing to do. Getting out of a car, walking over to a crowd, you know no one, you don't know what sort of people they are, shaking hands and having a conversation. Very, very difficult indeed. I mean, much more difficult than having a chat with someone on the minor bus here in Durban. And she also had to deal with the beginning of monarchy as a soap opera. And people think, oh, Harry and Andrew. But no, it goes a long way back. It goes back to Princess Margaret and all that was happening around her in her difficult life. And then you had the divorce of her son and Princess Diana, Princess of Wales, and all that circled around that. So it's a very difficult legacy to take over. She also had stature. And she was able to maneuver Britain nearly psychologically out of the imperial mindset, because she was crowned as an empress, into the concept of Britain as a monarchy. In other words, looking back to the old, nearly medieval kingdom that existed in England at that time. So her legacy is considerable, and she did it in a very quiet. She also, changed herself. For instance, her accent. You listen to how she spoke when she was 20 years old, when she was being crowned, and then you listen to her, 40 years later. She had an upper class, crystal accent. That goes. Whether she had elocution lessons or not, I don't know. But it disappears. And things like that people sometimes don't notice. She did. But she was a very quiet person. I think she was quite a shy person. Being a monarch, you cannot involve in politics. and you can advise a prime minister, and you can warn a prime minister, but you're basically signing documents,
right?
And you're pressing the flesh.
Fascinating detail. I wonder, though, how much of that impact do you reckon has to do more with the fact that she spent so much time on the throne than the caliber of leadership she actually carried out during that time? You know, I mean, it's almost impossible to see Charles being able to give us a 70-year reign.
Yeah, look. I think credit due where credit's worth, and I think if Edward VIII, who abdicated whenever it was 1937, 1938, hadn't abdicated and continued,
right.
To say I think the monarchy would be dead. Now Charles, impossible shoes to fill, and that sort of argument. But you never know. You never know. People do step up to the mark, and I've seen this in universities where we bring in a young person as a junior lecturer, and they're very naive, and they're very junior, and they're very insecure, and blow me down, they blossom, and he may. How you can, I mean, I'm nearly 70. Whether you can blossom at that age of life, I'm not quite sure. But he will do things, and I think it's fairly predictable what he will do. I don't think he's a choice in the matter. Already they're talking about a slimmed down monarchy. Now, by a slimmed down monarchy, they mean having less working royals, and basically those that do the job and do the job properly, and not fuss around and spend their time, with the media and what have you. I think the financial arrangement will have to be relooked at. Now, it was looked at under Elizabeth, and she starts paying taxes, but the wealth of the monarchy, you see, you have to divide the royal family as an individual with individual wealth, and as an emblem of state. It's not like a state president who comes in as a figurehead and goes out and takes their salary or what have you. It's more complicated than that. The other thing is that the whole system of titles and awards, now all countries have those, or nearly all countries have those, but I think that they'll be whittled down. And things like the OBE, I mean, you talk about the OBE and the MBE, but do you really think about that, what it's saying? It's the Order of the British Empire, it's a member of the British Empire. Well, where said the Irishman, it's the British Empire these days.
Right.
And I think that they will go. And the other thing that I think has to go are the palaces. I think that they need to, and they will, reduce the number of royal palaces. Apart from the fact of the cost of keeping up these things, I mean, keeping this old house in Durban up is expensive enough. What it must be to keep up, Sandringham, Buckingham Palace, the one up in Scotland, what have you. I don't know. And anyway, in an age of austerity, which we're moving into, and remember when Queen Elizabeth became queen in 1953, Britain was coming out of the Second World War and was broke. It was absolutely broke. And there was austerity. So in a way, he's in a similar position, but he's a 75-year-old, whereas she was a 20-year-old.
Right.
If he could all.
You mentioned You mentioned the royal palaces, and I suppose that allows us to segue into my next question. There were a lot of senior royals that were there, including, of course, the Prince and Princess of Wales, as well as their children. But the people who are notably missing was Prince Harry, right? And we all perhaps can speculate around why that's the case. But I certainly saw less reportage around their absence than perhaps you would have seen a couple years ago. What, if anything, do you read into that?
Well, of course, Prince Harry was there, but he was third row back, and he was being obscured by Princess Anne's feather, which was most unfortunate. But of course, his wife wasn't there, which was highly significant, and his children went there, whereas there were young children that were. In fact, I think there was a deliberate policy to put the children to the fore for various reasons. Look, the whole Harry thing is an utter disaster, and I cannot understand why it wasn't managed at the beginning, before it got out of hand, because it did get out of hand. It reminds me, as a historian, of what was going on in the monarchy when George IV became king in 1821. And incidentally, an awful lot of what we saw yesterday went back to his monarchy. The great gold coach, the one that rocks like you're on the ocean, and the robe that he wore, the golden robe that he wore, that was from George IV. But his coronation was vast and in many respects not a disaster. And he'd fallen out with his queen, and she turned up at Westminster Abbey and started knocking on the door and demanded to be let in, and they slammed the doors in her face. It was dreadful. Dreadful PR. Well, similarly with the Harry story, that it was allowed to get to the state where you have basically a court in exile in California, I think was I'm afraid says something about the governance, that exists, that wasn't stopped earlier on, and some kind of a compromise can be made. I mean, by Jove, if we in South Africa and being an Irishman back home in Ireland, we can come to some kind of agreements, the royal family can come to some kind of agreement.
Right. Absolutely. It's fascinating stuff to listen to. And yeah, I suppose as the cliche goes, time will tell when it comes to how the rest of the few years ahead of King Charles will actually play out. But it's certainly a gratifying listen to your recollection as we connect the dots. Emeritus Professor of History at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, that's Donal McCracken. Once again, thanks very much indeed.